Hey, welcome to another episode of A Lifetime of Mafia Tales. I'm your host, Adrian Martinez, and of course, I'm joined by my co-host, Salvatore Polisi, also known as Sally Bots. Today, we go into Sal's early life in the Mafia and becoming a bookie. Sal explains how he learned the ropes of becoming a bookie from his uncle Tony and Dominic Cataldo, a hitman for the Colombo family. Sal also tells a very funny story about John Gotti and his brother Gene Gotti. Sal also explains how Sammy the Bull went from one crime family to another. We also talk about Sonny Franzese being a real mob guy. He died and never once acknowledged the word mafia. And without further ado, let's get into Sal's story. One quick thing before we get started with this podcast. This episode is just half of it. The rest of it's on Patreon. If you want to get our full podcast, please subscribe to our Patreon channel. Our Patreon channel link is in the video description below. Yes, this is episode 2. We're going to be talking about Sal's early life, going into the mafia and becoming a bookie, and the schemes and everything that went around him becoming a bookie and owning a pizza shop and so on. So this is going to be an interesting episode. So everyone just get ready for this because Sal's got a lot of funny stories coming up. So how you doing today, Sal?
Good. It's a great day. And I look forward to sharing these experiences and these stories. I mean, it gets a little crazy, but I have to take myself back 50 years and try to remember what this excitement was all about.
Yeah, I mean, me and you have talked. I mean, you always had this adrenaline for, being an adrenaline junkie. You like chasing that high, and kind of explain that to the people that don't know what that is to you.
Yeah. It. I think when I look back in my life, it was like when you stole something, and you got away with it. You sort of like had this rush of excitement. But I really think that, if it was a small item, it didn't move me. And if it was simple, it didn't move me. What moved me was the complexities of thinking about crime in the future. Like you see television shows and you see something, outrageous like Ocean's 11. And how do they pull all that off? So one time I met Al Pacino about 15 years ago. I went to one of his screenings
Mm-hmm.
and I said something to him. And it was a girl who introduced me to him. And he said, I heard about you. You really lived it. I go, yeah. You acting in film, you got 2 or 3 takes. I said, when I robbed the bank, I got 1 take. 1, and I couldn't fuck up, So he laughed his ass off.
Yeah, that's really interesting because from him, always being the actor and portraying, this gangster, this mobster. For him to actually meet some guy that was in it, I'm sure he met a lot of guys, and to get his his acting right, or whatever you want to call it, but help advisors and stuff. But that's funny that you had that encounter, because I'm sure after the life and you went to Hollywood and stuff, which we'll also eventually get to, but I'm sure you met a lot of cool people there in Hollywood. And
but one of the things that we had in common, before I forget to tell you this, was the agent that I have now, the literary agent.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband was a wealthy guy. He's older now. He bought the rights to the first book, Sins of the Father.
Okay.
And he wrote a script, and his friend was Pacino.
Really?
So they had two readings, but Pacino's, sort of like advisors, after they had the reading, Pacino said to Bob, his name was Bob Fields, that's my agent's husband, you know what? It's not there. And in the film business, you got to say, if it's there, you go, it's on the page. But Pacino didn't like the script. So when this girl introduced me to Pacino, I said, hey, you remember Bob Fields and the reading of Sins of the Father? He goes, yeah. I go, that's me. He goes, oh my God, he said, and that's how we started our conversation, about doing the banks. And I had 1 take, I said.
No, that's a little funny side story, man. That's what, there's all these encounters that you go through in life. And
right.
It's just insane that you went from being, on the street level to actually meeting the actors and, all these well-known people that, acted and portrayed you guys and, on the movie on the big screen.
Because that girl from England, she said to Pacino, I'm going to introduce you to the real Chili Palmer.
And what did he say?
You got to know who Chili Palmer was. He was in the movie with James Gandolfini and Get Shorty. The Get Shorty movie. He played this Chili Palmer guy, which was a gangster from Miami who goes to Hollywood and gets involved with producing movies.
Damn.
So
Okay.
they called me the real Chili Palmer. So it was funny how that happened.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look up into that guy some more, man, because
Yeah.
I really don't know that one. I mean, that'd be interesting to dive into, because maybe we could do a whole episode or something about
Oh
him as
yeah,
well.
it's an old movie, and Gandolfini was in there, the guy from
Yep.
Sopranos.
So, yep.
And so
Tony.
Travolta threw Gandolfini down the steps in the movie, and Gene Hackman and Danny DeVito. It was a very funny movie. The very
Damn.
famous writer wrote the movie. So, people started to introduce me. Oh, this is the real Chili Palmer.
Yeah. Well, I suppose segueing back into your early life. When you became a bookie for the Mafia. I mean, what were
Yeah.
you essentially doing? How did this even happen? What were the events that led up to this?
Well, my uncle Tony was deeply involved with gambling, and so he had gamblers that would bet with him. So I would have to go meet the gamblers and take their little bets on a little piece of paper. Well, the problem with the little piece of paper was in those days it was evidence, and you get arrested immediately if you got a bunch of little pieces of paper with a guy's name on their bet. But I had such an incredible memory. I told Uncle Tony, I could memorize 20 or 30 bets. Okay, go see these guys, get their bets, and memorize them. And after you memorize them, meet these guys, write it down on a cheat sheet, sort of a cheat sheet, and then bring it to me. And I proved to him I could memorize 20, 30 bets with names on them.
Wow.
And so
that never
therefore,
got you in trouble?
well, in the beginning, that was exciting to do that. But in New York in those days, they had they had a gambling sheet, okay,
Mhm.
called the racing form. And just carrying it, you could get arrested for that. So gambling was very strict in those days. Of course, if you were with the right bookies and the right mob, they paid off and you never got arrested. But a lot of guys didn't want to pay, so you were always
No.
subject to get arrested. So if you got arrested, it was like Henry and Goodfellas. You go in for the night, you come out, they pat you on the back, you pay a $10, $20 fine, and that was it. So I was learning early on with Uncle Tony the whole gambling business, which to me was really fascinating. About these $2 bets, and you could take 20 bets, maybe one guy would win. I mean, if there was 12 horses in a race, if you had 12 different bets, how could you lose? I mean, you were getting the money from 12 bettors. Maybe if the horse win and paid $10, you still made $20 from taking all that bet. So it was very sophisticated. It was very mathematical. You couldn't miss making money taking horse bets.
So
Kind of fun.
I was gonna say, so when you started to get exposed to all this, the gambling operations and stuff, what would it look like on a daily basis? Was it just the $2 bets, or would people? When in the beginning, it was probably just the $2, but then you started getting up involved with the higher end
Yeah,
on money.
you had guys that were $2 bettors. They were legitimate, like say, guy worked for the transit authority, guy was a bus driver, But what went along with the $2 bets was if they kept betting, they didn't believe it, but we knew they were going to lose. So then you would lead them to getting a Shylock loan. They would borrow $100 because sometimes they didn't have the money for the bets, and you gave them credit. Okay, you owe me $42. In 2, 3, 4 weeks, you owe me $100. Where's the $100? Could I borrow $100? Yeah, you loan them $100 and you charge them $5 a week interest, which was 5%. I mean, that's 10 times what you're getting in the bank. So you were always loaning out 100 here, 100 here. You kept your customers. They lost money. You loaned them money. Then they had to pay up eventually. You didn't have to threaten them or anything. They were your customers.
Yeah.
And that's how you learned gambling, bookmaking. And there was other parts of the business. Like there was what they called a numbers business,
Mhm.
which is sort of like a lotto in the 60s. You bet like $1 and you get back, what was it? You get back $50. Okay. No, I'm sorry. You bet, you got 50 to 1, okay. So if you bet 10 cents, you got $50. But the guys who were taking those numbers, it was started in Harlem with the black generation up there, and
Mhm.
it was the big business. And then the mob started to figure out in the 30s and 40s how to make money with it. So it was all hand in hand, bookmaking, numbers, shylocking, even in the early, I should say the late 60s, gambling became more popular with especially in 1969, which was 14 years later, which was when the Yankees, I'm sorry, the Mets, the Knicks, the Nets, they all won championships. So people started betting sports. But sports wasn't that big in the 50s. It was mostly horses.
Yeah. So when you were doing these, the number running, what did that look like? You just go into people's establishments, go up to their houses, and say, "Hey, you
Right.
want to bet?" Or did you
Yeah.
already have a clientele, or did you have to go up and make new clients?
No, my uncle had a client. My uncle, especially like barber shops. You would go to the barber shop, and the guy would give you like a little envelope with 10 or 15 bets and the money in there. And you take it back and give it Uncle Tony. He would go sit down on the phone and call the bets in because he didn't book them himself. He just wanted, to get a percentage like. And normally the percentage was, he'd make 50, 60% on those bets. If he didn't want to keep some of the bets, then he would get a 10% fee, what they call hot and cold. In other words, on the winnings, he would get 10%. If somebody won $1,000, he would still get $100. If they lost $1,000, he'd get $100. So there
Oh,
was ways to be involved with the gambling with the mob where you couldn't miss making money,
right.
except if you were getting high on your own supply, which meant if you were gambling,
Yeah.
you know,
So there was always a way to make money, whether they win or they lose, because you think they win that 1 out of 50 odds that you talked about.
yeah.
So if they win that, you get 10% of it.
You
And
could if you were on that basis. What they call 10% hot or cold. So if you took in $1,000 for the day, you knew you made $100.
oh,
Just give
okay.
it to another bookie who moved it up. Like there
Mhm.
was bigger bookies. They took the big bets. Like your dream was to have like a bet on every horse in the race. Well, you couldn't miss unless the horse paid some ridiculous money, which wasn't going to happen, just rarely. So if a horse paid $4 or $5 and you had 15 bets, you made on 14 bets or 12 bets. So in the long term, you were going to win if you were booking it.
So
You were betting it, you weren't going to win.
so if they had multiple bookmakers or bookies that these guys were going to, they could actually bet on each one of these horses, and no matter what, they'd win.
Yeah, of course. The bookies always won, just like Vegas. They're going to win forever. But that was in the mid '60s. In the '70s, gambling kicked up. There was more activity, more exposure. Okay, and then there was changes then. But in the early years when I learned the business, I learned that it was all really based on the little better. My uncle would rather have 50 little betters than one big better.
Really? How
The big
come?
better, you lost the money. If he won, you lost a bunch of money. But if you
Mm,
had a lot of small betters, you're always going to make money, and your business wasn't in jeopardy. And occasionally, you had to pay off some of the cops to leave you alone.
mhm. So what did you guys have any systems in play where you would rig it in your favor and scam people out of it, or
No,
was it
we
pretty
didn't
legit?
have to because the odds were against them every time. I
So
mean,
you
there was a couple of scams and schemes that I probably could tell you one which is absolutely fascinating. It's sort of like if you watch the movie The Sting,
mhm.
how they wrote that movie was fascinating. So there was always a con, but you had to know, who to con, when to con, and if you could get away with it. So there was ways that the mob sort of, focused on independence. The independent guys were booking too. And you didn't want that competition. So you had to scare those guys. You had to do things like break their windows or something. I mean, this all kind of stuff was early on in the 60s.
Yeah. And so in your time while you were doing this booking, bookmaking kind of stuff, what did you when you had to loan out money to people, you never had to chase them down or deal with anything like that? People
Well,
not
I
wanting
didn't.
to pay up?
Yeah, I didn't do it in the early years. I just turned it over to my uncle. He did it.
Oh,
But
so
between 65 and 67, I learned all the business.
mhm.
Then when I made this score, which I'll talk about, I guess we could spend a whole hour talking about how I did this score to get this $30,000, which was an absolute, fortune then. You have to understand a new car only cost $2,000, $2,500 in 1965. So in in comparison, if I stole money today, well, how much would it cost for 10 cars? Like 300,000, right?
Yeah.
So $30,000 was a lot of money in 1965.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll get to that whole story. That'll take a half an hour to explain the whole thing and
Yeah.
how I got away with the money and how Uncle Tony took the money and bought this little store operation so we could increase the gambling business.
Mm-hmm.
And that took about a year or so. And then he went to jail in 67, I think it was. But by that time, I had learned the business pretty good. And a guy had come out of jail that he knew, a young guy, and the guy came and introduced himself to me. And it was Dominic Cataldo, who was a Colombo guy from the beginning. So I continued with Cataldo on the gambling business. But he was doing a lot of other stuff. So I was learning all kinds of crime at 20, 21, 22 years old.
Yeah. And you did bring up for our next episode, to give people a little teaser, we're going to cover when Sal started to get exposed and learning all the Mafia rules. We're going to go into detail about what those rules were,
right,
and what guys did appreciate those rules and the guys that broke them, because there was a lot of guys that broke them.
Oh yeah.
So
what you could do and what you couldn't do, or what you could do and what you got away with. But then there was certain rules where you couldn't step on other people's toes. You had to pay attention to the quiet rules that the mob guys had. A lot of it was about control, because you got to realize the mob was selling itself on. It was interesting at that time because you had these groupies in other forms of, the United States, which were a crime, but they were sort of like cult figures, cults, like Manson cults, all these cults. Well, actually, I didn't know it and didn't believe it, or didn't reveal my inner feelings, but I knew the mob was a cult. It really was, because they put the organization before you and your family and your kids. They wanted you to believe in it. They were selling something. And of course, years later, 15, 20 years later, the master salesman was none other than John Gotti. He sold everybody on, you come with me, I'm going to be the light, But I saw through that years before, and I didn't want to become a made guy. Right. So in the late 60s, I should say late 60s, early 70s, I was still enamored with it. I really followed the whole thing like a cult. Secret organization, you had passwords and you had signals, it was like playing a game as a kid, really, it was funny.
Yeah. And then, you said that in 1969, you weren't going to Woodstock. What were you doing?
No. By that time, see, this was 65, 66, 67. I was learning about gambling. Then I sort of graduated when Cataldo came out. I learned more about crime. Then I learned about organized crime. These guys were hijacking trucks in 68, 69. That's what I wanted to do. But I was sort of learning like an apprentice. You had to pay your dues. So, of course, by 69, I was so influenced by the Italian culture, the mob and all. I wasn't interested in rock and roll. Everybody was heading up to Woodstock. I could care less. I was figuring out how to hijack trucks, how to rob. I was just figuring out ways to listen to how they scammed and how they planned robberies and stuff. And Cataldo, he had a whole robbery group. He had a regular crew, man. These guys, and they were bad. There were some badass guys, really killers.
Okay. So, I think with episode number 4, we can cover 1969, so we'll have the Mafia rules, one for everyone. That'll be our next one for episode 3. And then number 4 will be 1969. Sal wasn't going to Woodstock. He was going to do some ice.
No Woodstock. But, between 65, 66, when Uncle Tony went to jail around 67, I had gotten married and I ran the pizza joint. And then later on that year, or maybe I got married in April of 67, maybe in the fall, Dominic Cataldo showed up. He had been in jail with Uncle Tony in federal prison. He was getting out. Uncle Tony was in. And when he came out, he introduced himself. And my father, your father, and your uncle, they were all close family members back into the 1920s and 30s. Wow. So I'm here, and I got a bookmaking operation. Uncle Tony told me, your Uncle Tony told me you should work with me. And that was it. That's how I got working with Cataldo. And I had a little pizza joint.
So you said your family roots went way back. So was his, they were involved with the Profaci family too, I'm assuming, Dominic's family?
Right. The old Profaci family, which later became Colombo's, But what I wasn't aware of, there was these wars. There was mob wars going on for years in the 60s. And you know, he kept me away from that, Cataldo, because the best way for him to control me was keeping me away from all of that. And of course, there was the trust factor. I had to prove myself in the late 60s. And, you know, I'll talk about, you know, my experiences with Cataldo and the hijacking. That came like in the late 60s, 69, like that time. You know, they were doing certain things that I wasn't allowed to participate, you know, in.
Because you weren't made?
Oh, yeah, it wasn't about being made. No, you weren't trusted until like years went by. You know, nobody was getting made then. Cataldo wasn't a made guy.
Were the books closed or for
the books were closed at that time, right? It was closed all the way up to the 70s, like 72, 71.
When did it first start? When did
they stopped making the guys in 57, I think.
Oh, yeah, so almost 20 some years, damn.
About 15
yeah.
Yeah.
So then I think, you know, that would be, I mean, why were they closed? If you want to continue watching this episode, because this is only the halfway mark, please subscribe to our Patreon channel. We offer all of our exclusive interviews on there. Our Patreon link is in the video description below. Hey, thanks for watching this clip. This clip came from our Patreon channel. The name of our podcast is A Lifetime of Mafia Tales. Me and Sal's podcast is all about his life in the Mafia. Salvatore was a Colombo associate. Salvatore, also known as Sally Ubats, has many stories about committing crimes with all 5 of the New York crime families, such as hijacking, bank robberies, heists, and much more. Sal has many criminal stories about him and other high-ranking mobsters, such as John Gotti, Peter Gotti, Gene Gotti, Jimmy Burke, Angelo Ruggiero, Henry Hill, Dave Icovetti Sr., Tommy DeSimone, Dominic Cataldo, Joe Brancato, and many more. During his time as a mobster, he had a social club he opened called the Sinatra Club. He would later go on to write a book and a movie about his time in the Sinatra Club. Sal has a lot of untold stories about John Gotti that people haven't heard. And as myself, my name is Adrian Martinez. I've been doing a podcast for the last 2 years. It's called Invest in Yourself Podcast. I've done a number of Mafia interviews the last few years. I've done interviews with Mafia associates, made men, and capos, also known as bosses. Salvatore and I have decided to partner up to start our own podcast, to drop some new untold stories about the Mafia. Please subscribe to mine and Sal's Patreon account to watch all of our full exclusive videos about Sal's life in the Mafia. The link to subscribe to our Patreon channel is in the video description below.